I have some view graphs. It's probably a little bit more than an executive summary, but it's just to remind people that, um, what the book is about. I sent some people Cliff Notes, people that sent me email, and so I sent that out yesterday. That's more complete, but you couldn't possibly cover everything in the view graphs. So I'm going to share a screen, covering everybody's screen.
Yes, there it is.
Yeah.
Okay, let me just go back to the beginning. Okay, the book is called The Omnivores Dilemma. The author is Michael Pollan, published by Penguin Press in 2006, 335 pages, and we're going to go over it today. All right. There's a quote in the beginning of the book I kind of like. The koala bear doesn't worry about what to eat. If it looks and smells like a eucalyptus leaf, it must be dinner. So, but the rest of us have to fend ourselves. Okay, I I sort of have like an introduction to some of the concepts in the book. One of them is the industrial age. So these concepts help propel the industrial age, and their Eli Whitney developed interchangeable parts for military firearms. Parts required exact specification made to some tolerance, which was improved efficiency, reliability, and maintainability. Um, Ford's Model T manufacturing plant, mass produced on a moving assembly lines with interchangeable parts, tasks done repetitively by specialized workers. It used economics of scale and efficiency to keep the cost affordable. And the input, was a very large plant. At the input, raw materials were delivered at the entrance, and at the output, a car rolled off the line every 3 minutes. So, that really helped propel, the auto industry, and everybody could start to afford a car. Made it accessible to everybody. So now, if you look at the viewpoint from an agricultural point of view, up until the mid 1800s, every home had a house cow. So I think the age was
That's not true.
1865, but I couldn't find a reference to that. Okay. However, over time, by the 1900s, small dairy farms supplied milk to others. So people sort of got out of agriculture slowly. The one thing I find interesting, I sort of have a association with, farm from time to time. And, in 1958, my father took the family, we were driving through Switzerland, and we got caught up. It's a narrow valley, it's a single road. They're bringing the cows down from the Alps, very steep hillsides. And I was able to talk to them, and I find out that they're milked once per day. So they're milked in the morning, they bring them up on these steep slopes, they eat their grass, they come back, they spend the time in the barn. They're rumen because they're made to eat hay, digest all that. The next day they can put out, 6 to 8 gallons per day, depending on the breed. Okay, by 1990, I was in a farming area in Bavaria. And I talked to them. They milk them twice a day. They kept them in the barn. I milked them at 6 a.m. in the morning, 6 p.m. in the evening. And if I look up in the Wikipedia, actually on the internet, by doing it twice a day, they get 28 to 45% more milk. And in 2000, my wife and I were in the Amish country with a bed and breakfast that was a dairy farm, and they milk them 3 times a day. Now, they actually told me they get 90 gallons of milk per cow. So I tried to verify that on the internet, and I really couldn't. The best I could come up with is they get an additional 12 to 20% more milk over milking them twice a day. And if you do the math, you get maybe about 15 gallons. But anyway, so the goal has always been to increase production on an agricultural scale, okay? And then over time, all these small dairy farms and small farmers became mega farms, planting and harvesting on an industrial scale. And the other thing in general is, and this wasn't mentioned in the book, uh, you know, I mean, it's true for cows, but it was also true for other animals, other livestock, is they're given a continuous antibiotic feed that kills gut bacteria. But they also found out it gives 10% faster growth. So it's kind of hard to get off that treadmill because farmers were making more money by doing that. Okay. People employed in agriculture in the US in 1960, 12 million out of 180 million. That's 7% of the population. By 2020, it's 2 million out of a population of 330. That's 1%. So basically, it's a very small fraction of the population that's feeding the rest of the country. You know, the one thing I noticed and I reconfirmed on the internet is by 2007, the world population that lives in urban areas surpassed 50%. So what that means is over time, people are not in tune with nature anymore or how their food is grown. So these, okay, now there's a preface I like to put in the book that these are some things that he actually didn't mention in the book. You know, there's 8 grades of US beef, prime, choice, select, standard, commercial, utility, cutter, and canner. Okay, I remember in in the 60s, my mother used to buy meat at the local Acme. It was labeled select. Okay, so you think that's a pretty good cut. Okay, but what that meant, it was lean, and because it wasn't marbled, it was a little less juicy or tender. If I, in more recent years, if you go to the store, you'll notice them, they're labeled choice. So that's marbled, but not as marbled as the highest grade. And if you go to Costco always emphasized prime. So I was there the other week and I noticed they had prime and choice, which they didn't have before. So they actually, you know, choice is always a little cheaper than prime. So they gave people an option which one to get. And if you look at the canner, which is box meat, this is probably what they shipped to the soldiers in World War II, you know. But anyway, the one thing he didn't mention is grass-fed beef produces variable results in taste. Okay, so, and they actually knew this early on. And so one motivation for feeding them corn is because corn-fed beef will produce a consistent taste that's flavorful. Okay, the disadvantage, as you find out in part 1, is that it's not compatible with their digestive system. Okay, in a local farmers market, you know, Jersey Fresh, there's one person selling grass-fed cattle, okay, meat. And I talked to him, I mentioned this fact to him. He says, well, yeah, our cattle is grass-fed, but in the last 100 days, they feed it corn. And they do this precisely for this reason, to give it a consistent taste. So, you know, typically it's 18 months to raise a steer. And if you fed corn the whole time, it would be detrimental, but the last 100 days are somewhat tolerable. So the book is divided into 3 parts, and it contrasts food sources and methods. So part 1 is basically corn and cows, industrial farming. Part 2 is a viable alternative called pastoral farming. And part 3 is the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, which people live for, you know, many millennium, but it's not practical anymore just due to the size of the population. Okay, so so here's part 1, industrial corn in Iowa. Okay, so these are the chapters in this part 1. So you have the plant, which is corn, and they say it most likely developed from a tropical grass called Zea maize. And other plants fixate carbon-3. Corn fixates carbon-4, so it has a higher energy content. but only 3% of the plants do this. Okay, and one way they can determine what somebody ate is analyze the isotope carbon-13, because C4 molecules will have more of the carbon-13. Now, when I was putting this together, I noticed there's a C4 rice project. Rice is normally a C3 plant, but they were trying to modify it to make it C4, which would give it more energy and thus feed more people. But so far they haven't, you know, they don't have a result yet. So principally he talks about a farm, George Nyler farm, 470 acres, and he calls corn the welfare queen. So he gets $150 per bushel. It costs him $250 to grow. He has to use, 200 pounds per acre synthetic fertilizer, not to do this. There's other things on top of it, and but he's not recovering his costs for growing it. Then they talk about the elevators, which are grain silos. So two companies, Cargill and Archer Daniel Midland, buy the corn and store it. And these are two of the hybrids or corn breeds put out by Pioneer. When I was out in the Amish country, I saw trial fields with different strains of Pioneer corn, which obviously the company was trying out to see how they do. And if it does well, they would sell it to the farmers. Okay. Corn has been made a interchangeable part, so to speak, and they call it number 2 corn. And however, 25% of the cost of growing the corn is subsidized by the US government to the tune of almost $5 billion per year. So if we buy something in the store, really the government already has been paying for that. It may look cheap, but it's not really cheap. Then he talked about the feedlot. So these are called confined animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, and they feed this conglomerate of stuff, from fat to protein, vitamins, synthetic estrogen, antibiotics to prevent infection because they're eating corn, alfalfa, hay, silage, and all that is blended with corn. The one thing I know from other sources, he didn't go that well into the book, is the rumen, the digestive system of the cow, which includes the rumen, is made to break down the cellulose from grasses, okay? And it's an acidic environment, and the acid helps, protect everything. And when they eat corn, it becomes basic, and what they do is they get these abscesses in their digestive system. And when they break, these abscesses are bacteria, and when they break, it goes into the bloodstream, and when it goes into the bloodstream, it goes into the liver, and then they get sick from that. And in some cases, they just get sick, extremely sick, and sometimes die. So they have to, because they're feeding them corn, they have to feed them antibiotics, otherwise they run into this problem. So there's no way to really get around that. Okay. Now the processing plant, he talks about that. There's a myriad of compounds corn gets turned into, on the basic level, flour, oil, and other compounds. And some of these compounds are high fructose corn syrup. Once they figured out how to do that chemically, various acids, various sugars, and gums. Then he talked about the consumer. He called it the Republic of Fat. And today, because of the way the diet is and what you can buy in the store, 1 out of 3 born in 2000 will get diabetes. And he made the comparison, $1 buys 1,200 calories of corn chips, which is a lot of, calories to burn off, versus 250 calories of carrots, which would be healthier, but doesn't maybe have enough calories. Then he talks about the, the fast food meal. So this is all processed food. This you would think it would basically just have chicken and maybe wheat, but it's got 38 ingredients to make it palatable, and 13 come from corn, and some of the 13 that come from corn are compounds that are made in the processing plant. And they're too numerous to mention here. Okay, part 2, these are the chapters again. So he talks about Polyphase Farm. So it's 100 acres of pastures, 450 acres of forest. He raises chicken, beef, turkey, eggs, rabbits, pigs, and vegetables. And he does it in a sustainable way. He talks about big organic that started small, now became industrial. And he mentioned all these companies. It's a very long story I won't go into. He mentioned grass and how Joe Salatin uses rotational grazing. So it's a mixture of grasses. He lets the cows or the cattle graze after the burst of growth. They eat that, and he moves the cattle along. And after that, he moves in the chickens and so on. He talks about practicing complexity, pasture plus forest. He's got portable fences, eggmobile, rack and house, and a gobbly go. This is for rabbits. This is for turkeys. And he tries to mimic what happens in nature. And he talks a little bit about the slaughter. The government will only allow him to slaughter chickens. Talks about how that's done. And he says his bacterial levels are very low compared to commercial enterprises. Then he talks about the market. So he believes in selling locally only. He won't ship anywhere. So he sells it locally to people at farmers markets, and it's delivered to restaurants. And then he just talks about having a meal at his house, corn, chicken, vegetable, fruits. Okay. Now just comparing the two is contrasting industrial versus pastoral farming. So here's industrial, the Nyler farm, here's pastoral. So you have, on one hand, you have annual species, soy and corn, they need to be planted every year. He has perennial species, he doesn't have to do anything. One is monoculture, meaning either you grow corn or when or the corn is fed to feedlots, and the feedlot is a monoculture. And what the other case is polyculture. The industrial uses a lot of fossil fuel in various ways. Polyfarm relies only on solar energy. On the left, you have they sell anywhere on the global market. He likes to sell only locally. On the left, specialized. On the right, diversified. On the left, mechanical. On the right, biological. So there's like less energy involved to do this. On the left, imported fertility. He has to buy, petrochemical fertilizer because using manure from the feedlots is so strong it just kills the plant. Okay. On the right, he's able to use local fertility in an efficient way. On the left, myriad of inputs. On the right, chicken feed. Okay. Now for pastoral grass, a pasture of grass will produce 30,000 eggs, 10,000 broilers, 800 stewing hens, 5 sides of beef, which is 25,000 pounds, 250 hogs, 1,000 turkeys, 500 rabbits. And this is all on 100 acres of pasture, but he needs that 150 acres of forest. And online, I found out that his annual net income, gross income was 350,000. So it doesn't sound like he's being subsidized in any way. He's making pretty good money. Now, the last chapter is the alternative hunter-gatherer lifestyle. He mentions a couple of things is by cooking certain foods, you can actually remove bitter toxins. There's something interesting about the Mexicans who took corn and beans and added lime to it. And lime does something chemically so that you get a complete protein out of it. So that means you get all the essential amino acids out of it. And I find that very interesting because how did they figure that out? And he talked about, um, the slaughterhouses for regular animals, talked about the wild boar, the fungi, and the perfect meal, which is all made from, hunted and gathered stuff or grown himself. Okay, so the epilogue to all this is, you know, the CAFOs with their continual antibiotic field, they produce antibiotic resistant strains that are more virulent. And here are two cases. One is the antibiotic resistant E. coli in 2007. I, I came across this by accident, this article. There was, 6 full pages in the New York Times. It was American Chef Selection Angus beef patties that were grilled. Apparently they weren't grilled enough to kill everything. They went into the whole story of how there were 5 different types of meat that came from 5 different states or countries. One of it was actually Angus, which was lean, but the rest of it was various cuts, and one of the cuts had 50% fat. And the reason they add that is so that the hamburger has 35% fat, which is what gives it its nice flavor. Okay, and this is put out by Cargill. And there's this woman, 22 years old. She was paralyzed when stricken with this strain of E. coli. I also came across another one. There was another outbreak. They said Cargill was the most likely source of the outbreak. It was a Schengen toxin produced by a different E. coli strain. It affected 4 states. 6 were hospitalized. 1 had a type of kidney failure, and 1 in Florida died. So, these things can get serious. So another part of the epilogue is, although he didn't talk about this, besides corn production being subsidized, milk production is also subsidized. So they subsidize milk to stabilize the prices, so farmers don't go out of business. They have to do something with the milk. So they stockpile 1.4 billion pounds of cheese, and I'm not sure who eats this or how it gets used. The other thing is, he didn't mention this, but today 80% of wheat, corn, and soybeans are genetically modified. So they use the Roundup glyphosate. And the purpose of this is to be able to spread weed herbicides and not kill the crop. However, it's damaging to aquatic mammals and humans. And, a lot of people say it should be banned. Now, the interesting thing about this is, after a couple of years, it turns out that the weeds became resistant to Roundup. So what their plan now is to further genetically modify it so they can put another weed killer on. But you can have your comments on this. Okay, so the interesting thing is, if you bought stuff in the 60s, the fruit, vegetables, wheat, corn, whatever meat, whatever you bought, it's been modified, and grown. It's grown differently now. It's been modified, all kinds of stuff. So, like, one of the things is, they made the skin tougher for better transport, pest resistant, but it's hard to digest. In fact, I find, if I have green peppers that are cooked or apple peels, I'm chewing on it, and I can't break it down with my teeth, So, and the other thing is, things are bred for ever sweeter taste. So the corn I had in the 50s, it wasn't terribly sweet. It had flavor to it, but not terribly sweet. If you buy corn today, I mean, it's really super sweet. If you look at like grapes, like in the store, I came across grapes called like candy grapes. I tried one. They're really like a sugar bomb. So, what we're eating is not, or what we can buy to eat is not that great either. And the other thing is, there's a greater incidence of metabolic syndrome. 25% of the adult population have this. And so it's characterized by abdominal obesity, high blood pressure, high sugar and triglycerides, and low HDL, but I won't go into this that much. Okay, before I talk about possible discussion topics, let me, here's the author. He wrote 8 books. His second book was called A Place of My Own. He actually designed and built this little cabin in the woods, which became his writing room, which I thought was kind of interesting. The other thing is I found out his sister's Tracy Pollan, and she's married to Michael J. Fox, the actor.
Hmm.
Now here's Joe Saladin. The book doesn't have any pictures, but it's very descriptive. I can almost imagine everything. But here's a picture of what he looks like, and here's a picture of his pasture where he's herding, with movable fences so he can move the chickens around. And he himself has written 13 books on pastoral farming,
Huh.
and he got the Heinz Award in 2009 for special focus on the environment. Okay, here's George Naylor. He calls himself a dirt farmer, so he basically does corn and soybean monoculture farming. So since he's been a farmer since 1976, after the book was written, he transitioned to organic in 2014. He has this YouTube video called Parity or Disparity. And in it, he mentions that for corn, I told you what the price per bushel was. He says if the corn was priced at parity price, which means it kept up with inflation, he would be getting $13 a bushel, which obviously he's not getting anywhere near that. And for soybeans, it would be $30 a bushel. And I can send this out later. I have references to various things, but let me go down to this discussion topic. You can use this to start off with, or you can come up with your own. So in earlier years, people were in a feedback loop. So the food selected to maximize their health and longevity. So this is dependent on what crops and animals are in the area, but eventually they figure out what's better and what's not good until they optimize it. So I mentioned the Mexicans, they add lime to beans and corns to get all 22 essential amino acids. The Chinese, they believe every meal should have 5 tastes. That's sweet, sour, salty, spicy, and bitter. Some of this just to maintain a more balanced diet so it's not high in fat or terribly glycemic. The Chinese and Japanese, they make a lot of use of mushrooms for therapeutic use. And for instance, if you get hot and sour soup, it's got these fleshy little mushrooms in it, and they're called brown wooden ears because they look like ears off the side of a tree. But it turns out they're very effective blood thinners, and they put that in there so they could, basically for health reasons. And with industrial agriculture, corporations are in a feedback loop to themselves. So, they want to maximize productivity, which means monoculture, antibiotics, CAFOs. They want to maximize shelf life. They used to use butter, but they went to partially hydrogenated fat because, butter becomes rancid, right? But if you use
Yes.
partially hydrogenated fat, it's got the same consistency, but doesn't get rancid. However, it damages arteries. To reduce spoilage, they put in preservatives. But, the health of a person is really determined by the, gut microbiome. So, that can make and break a person's health. So these preservatives could damage that. They also maximize the profit of corporations, but not farmers. Farmers are raising things below cost now. Okay, so what is the true cost of growing and raising fuel and health? The book also mentioned that for the industrialized farming, it uses an awful lot of fossil fuel to do its job, and that's a hidden cost. Okay, so with that, I'd like to turn it over to a discussion.
Well, Walter, thank you very much. You are very, very thorough and prepared.
and we really enjoyed your presentation. And now what I'm going to do is call on each individual that's on this thing with us and have them give us their impression of the book and maybe ask you some questions. So I'll start with Mark Edelman. Mark, how did you like the book?
He's not there right now. I don't see him.
Okay,
Oh, there he is.
I wasn't ready to make any particular comment. I loved the book, but I don't want to just BS about it. So I'd rather pass to somebody who has something definite to say at this moment.
Okay, you're passing your gavel, right? You're like in Congress.
Yes.
How about you, Colin? What Colin Foles? This is Colin Foles. What did you think of the book?
Well, I thought it was a well-written book, and I must admit I learned a lot from reading this book, and especially the impact of number 2 corn. I did not realize the scale of number 2 corn in our industrial food production. The other thing that I want to make a comment about the slaughter of animals. That reminds me of The Jungle, which I read many years ago by Upton Sinclair, and he talked about the slaughtering of animals back in the early part of the 20th century, and how horrible it was, and how regulations were put in by the federal government because there was an uproar about the animal slaughtering in Chicago slaughterhouses. And the thing that struck me from reading the book, by the way, is the sausage manufacturing, how they made sausages. After I read that book, I couldn't eat sausages for a while. The other comments I'd like to make is, in the very beginning of the book, he talks about something I think is very important. I never fully appreciated this photosynthesis. How without photosynthesis, most of animal life wouldn't exist, because the oxygen level was almost zero when the planet was cooling down. So without plant life and photosynthesis, we would not have oxygen in the world, so we wouldn't be here.
Right.
The other comment I'd like to make is this sustainable? This especially with the pollution from it and the effect on climate change. And the other question, I'm just going to make a comment. What's the impact of this book after it was written 17 years ago? Has anything changed? Have we done anything to change our ways, or are we just going to go on the same way as ever? Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. How about you, Kai? What do you think?
Yes, I recognize that this book has received numerous accolades, but I was less than impressed and less than enthusiastic about the book. It was too detailed, took too long to read, had excessive details that I felt were not necessary to get to the point. The author, he was very articulate, descriptive, but at times I thought I was reading a handbook on corn raising. And some of the aspects were also rather exaggerated in terms of going out for the morels or the mushrooms.
Right.
I also felt that the author must have sat with a thesaurus at his side. But he chose to use a lot of polysyllabic words rather than making something to make his impression.
Right.
So I would give this a lukewarm recommendation.
Okay.
Too long, detailed, and the conclusions were vague. Before I conclude, I do have one comment I'd like to make. For those, since we have 17 participants, you may be aware that Morristown is having a festival of books, October 7th and 8th. They're having over 30 authors there, both fiction and nonfiction. If you're interested, morristownbooks.org. And the featured speaker is James Patterson, who's considered one of the foremost current readers right now. So it's a different style of writing, I recognize, but there are quite a variety of books that will be made available, and the authors are there to discuss them. Those are my
Okay.
comments.
Well, thank you, Kai.
Can I
And
say a
Mark,
couple of things? I kind of have to
Alright.
agree. I have to agree with Kai. You know, when I read the book, years ago, I mean, what I basically remember, corn and cows and and the problems with that, and the pastoral farming method, and the difference between that. And when I had to reread the book because I have to host this and know what I'm talking about, I found it extremely tedious to reread. And I made those cliff notes so I don't so I could get just the facts that I needed and not all the all the rest of the stuff which is sort of by the wayside.
The book reminded me a little bit of my Handbook of Physical Chemistry by Gladstone, which I had in undergraduate school.
How about you, Marv? I know you have to go. That's why I'm putting you right on.
Thanks, John. I agree with Kai 100%. Everything you ever wanted to know about hunting mushrooms was in that book, in that chapter, and that turned me off. But the one comment, he commented about the grass-fed chickens and the quality of the eggs and the egg yolks. And it reminded me of maybe in the early 1990s or late 80s, we were in France. And we were at a restaurant and we had omelets. And those were the most colorful, beautiful eggs I can remember. And I have never seen anything in this country to match it. And just wondering, is the industrialization of of meat and chicken processing in this country, is it unique to us? Are the French, are the Europeans doing the same thing? Are we unique? What's going on in other countries?
Can I answer that?
Yes, go ahead.
There are differences between what Europe does and what the US does. Like for instance, in the US you have to refrigerate the eggs, and Europe they don't refrigerate them. Eggs really keep quite well without refrigeration. And the other thing is, if somebody in Europe sees an egg and the yolk is yellow, they think it went bad because their yolks are bright orange. And the reason it's bright orange is exactly what was talked about in the book, and it sort of varies with the season, whether it's a winter egg or a summer egg or a spring egg. And, and also Europe doesn't have the room to raise cattle really. So that, the meats used over there are basically pork and chicken and fish, I guess, because and veal, because because if they raise cows for, they have to, in order for them to give milk, they have to give birth. So half of them will be cows and half of them will be males, and they can't do anything with them because they can't. There's no place to graze for them. So what they do is, they keep them, for the first 3 months milk fed, and they become veal. So there's a lot of veal over there, which you don't really have in this country. But, but there, I don't know how industrialized Europe has become, but, chances are it's less industrialized than here.
Thanks,
Thank you.
guys.
Thank you.
John, thanks, Walter.
Okay, thank you. All right, Jim Hewitt, how about you? What did you think of the book?
I don't have much to say because I haven't read it. I had,
Okay.
Bill
So you're
Tittle had said
All
that
right,
if you didn't have a chance to read the book, listen in if you'd like to learn something. So that's what I'm doing.
But thank you for supporting our book club, and we enjoyed having you here. How about you, Boppy?
I didn't read the book, but I read Walter's cliff note quickly. I believe that he has some interesting points, and I'm talking from my experience, as I was trying to say. My father, I grew up in India, Kolkata, a city in which my father kept cows in our backyard to get the milk. And it seems like customs and things like that kept Hindus in India never eat cows. And they don't allow slaughtering of cows. And most people in India, like especially major cities, are Hindus. So the natural religious belief creates slaughtering of cows and things like that. And it has some good it's allows some, the belief seems to be allows some
Thank you.
some things.
Well, thank you. Thank you. How about you, Tom Tovich? How did you like the book?
Well, I didn't read the book, but I do have what I feel are some relevant comments from personal experiences. We've had the book in our household since it was published, and my son read it, and I've discussed it with him probably 10 or 15 or whatever number of years ago that was. So I know a lot about what was in it, and I did recently listen to an audio synopsis of the book, so I do have some familiarity with it. But maybe I guess late single digits. My son had his own chickens for 2 or 3 years, and we've had the eggs from them, and I would support what others have said, that definitely you can taste the difference. They didn't have to be refrigerated, and they were much better. He no longer has that, so this is a long time ago. And the other thing that I think is relevant is my son, who was born in 1981. My daughter was born in 1976, so there's 5 years between them. But my son, at the age of 25, contracted Crohn's disease, which is an intestinal disorder, of which at least currently there's no cure for from that standpoint. And he went through the normal medical practices, and really nothing helped a whole lot. He lost 30 pounds in a month. What ultimately helped him was that he went to acupuncture, and we don't certainly know, and there's not enough evidence, but that started him on a much better train. He doesn't take any medication and has been under control for 15 or more years. He's very active. He plays hockey, and just in his 40s, and he does that. But his research and all this stuff, which was part of why he read Omnivore's Dilemma, was he concluded through, it's certainly not scientific, but between the people that his colleagues and his peers from growing up in Summit and then moving to Pennsylvania, contrasted with my daughter, who was 5 years older, her peers, and she still lives in the area from Summit, a large proportion of my son's peers had intestinal disorders, Crohn's disease, uveitis, or irritable bowel syndrome, and a number of other things. And we certainly have no proof of it, but from his investigation, he is convinced that high fructose corn products are one of the causes, because somewhere between 1976 and 1981, they become much more prevalent. So we don't know, but it is evidence that leads him to think that way after considerable effort and research. I thought that's worth sharing.
What kind of corn products?
High fructose corn syrup, which is the
high fructose corn syrup. Okay.
Yeah, which is what that became very prevalent sometime after 1976 and continued to build after 1981. So it's not scientific, but it's a big enough sample to say that there could be something to that.
Well, thank you.
I'd like to make a comment here. A while back, I took one of these online courses, and it was by Coursera, and was called the Human Gut Microbiome. And it covered everything from the skin to the intestinal tract. And there's various probiotic bacteria that inhabits various parts of the intestinal tract. Each one is different.
Yes.
But the one for the large intestines, the purpose of them is to line the intestines and keep the digested food byproducts from which are essentially toxic, from penetrating the walls of the intestines, because then you get the bacteria will go in through the intestinal walls and into the body, and this causes a problem. And so there's a lot of emphasis on how to keep a healthy human gut microbiome. The other thing is that 70% of the nervous system goes from the stomach to the brain, and the bacteria actually manufacture B vitamins for the body. And so not having a healthy human gut
Intestinal flora.
microbiome means your health can be quite a bit diminished in
Yeah.
many respects. And I presume the high fructose corn syrup probably just feeds the wrong type of bacteria causing these problems.
I think
You know?
that's very likely.
Hmm. Well, thank you, thank you. Now we're going to the next guy, next member. How about you, Dick Aiken?
Well, I really like the book. I learned a lot. It gives a very broad, rich understanding of our whole food system. First of all, you talk about the paths from various sources to our tables. They're cows. They should be, grazed, but no, they're corn-fed and become overly fat. You talk about the paths from a so-called large-scale organic farms to Whole Foods. It simulates the small farm, but it's agribusiness. You have the small farms that really do work to give lots of foods with a little injection of the fertilizers and chemicals and so forth. So it really does talk about the structure of our food system. It brings in the technology and the science. You learn about the botany of corn and grass, and you things like photosynthesis and why corn is so all over the world. You learn about the biology of ruminants that was mentioned. You learn about the production of, now, most importantly, one thing you could think, the technology innovation was synthetic fertilizer. The fellow, your early 19th century started synthetic fertilizer, and then by mid 19th century, we were transitioning, as Walt was talking, from milk. Then into the 20th century, all the synthetic fertilizer really pushed up production at a cost, a really cost of other costs such as climate change. He talks about economics and politics, the corporate structure in agribusiness. The farm, they talk about the farm support bill. The naive person thinks that we're supporting farmers. No, he talks about the fact that we're supporting the big agribusiness, but the farmers themselves are losing money. It was great. Then indeed, he brings in the total costs of fossil fuels, the environment costs, and climate change. This is a broad book. It has a lot of stuff in it.
I agree.
Now, I really like the personal stories. We talked about the corn farmer, George Naylor. He's nearly growing broke. Then the mid-sized farmer who started out small, Joel Salatin, and he's the guy that has almost a complete ecosystem. He has a biological ecosystem to produce all of these goods from his 100 acres of farmland and 450 acres of woodland. And he needs the woods. Well, like he does everything. He slaughters his pigs. Then
Chickens.
he disposes of, how does he graze them? He puts their manure in, then he puts in some wood chips, and then he puts in more wood, and then more wood chips, and he raises up the food. And then he's allowed to slaughter his own pigs. So what does he
Chickens.
do? He really buries all of this stuff in his ground. And it is amazing. He has a complete system. And then, so I enjoyed the personal story. And then the hunter. I've never hunted, but you really learn something about hunting. Some things are just one thing after another. And he gathered mushrooms as well. So basically, I liked all of these things. It's well worth doing. Now, I liked it, but it's like a stew. You have good pieces here, you got good pieces here, and you throw them all together. I don't know who it was that Kai especially bring this out. It's a hard read, and it's all this stuff that's all mixed up together, and so it intermingles all these things, and it's difficult reading. but it's worthwhile if you really want to learn something. So I really appreciate Walt's summary. That was very good, Walt. I really appreciated it. And I know, I'll tell you what I did. I decided it was too much in it. So I'd read not a chapter, some section, a reasonable amount, and then I took a few notes. Not that I could actually reconstruct the book, but I hope that making notes would help me keep in mind things so that later, you know, in the ROM rather than the RAM of my mind, I would get something out of it. And I recommend that if you want to learn something and you read that, just read it, take a few notes, and just help yourself. Read it some more, take some notes, and then Walt, I'd like a copy of your slides, especially when you went table of contents each time they'll content, because Walt did a very good job of doing that. So those are my comments.
And anybody that wants a copy of my slides, send me an email and I'll send them out.
All right. Now we're going to go to Mitch. Mitch, before you start, I have to leave very quickly, and we still have 4 of you to go. Yourself, Steve Varley, Phil Abrazizi, and Rich Jaeger. Is there anyone else that I omitted? No.
Well, I
Okay.
have something to say now, so if I get a chance, but give the other people a chance first.
Mark Edelman. Okay, well, I'm going over that because I don't want anyone if I leave, Mitch, can you do one thing for me? Are you on here, Mitch? Mitch, are you on?
Unmute, Mitch.
Oh, yeah, sure. Sure.
The one thing you could do is do 2 things for me and email me when you finish. Make sure that Steve Varley, yourself, Phil, Rich Jaeger, and Mark have their can say their commentary, and Walter finishes, and pick the next date, which will be the 3rd Thursday in November, and pick the next book. So these fellows will recommend some books, come up with one, let me know, and we'll get that thing started again. But thank you for everyone here. I'm sorry I have to go at 3. Walter, you did a fabulous job, tremendous job. I appreciate it very much.
And
All
we
the
had a
rest of
good
you,
turnout.
a great turnout, and it's going to get better. So all the rest of you, I enjoyed it. And next time I'm going to put more time, allocate more time. I happen to have company in the house. That's why I have to get back to them. But in the meantime, have a good one, and I'll see you guys all soon. Tomorrow at Sports Forum, 2:00. Bye now.
Thank you, John.
I think that I'm up, and I'm also going to have to remember to get the other 4 guys. So I did read the book, and I took copious notes, pages and pages and pages. Let me break it down into some of the successes we've had in agriculture, where we are today. We've reduced the starvation and famine across the world. We've improved nutrition. Food is way cheaper and quote unquote better. The purity is better. Somebody mentioned the jungle from 120 years ago, and we have a fantastic variety of foods in the store if you compare the produce section today from when we were kids. Now, the problems are we're ruining our ecosystem, particularly in the agricultural Midwest, where I grew up. The economics are screwed up, as we talked about with some of the subsidies. There's a lot of questions about nutrition that Tom mentioned with his son, for instance. There are huge inequities, and right now we're seeing them in some of the nations that are starving because of the war in Ukraine, and they can't get the grain out of there. And there's that whole ethical treatment of animals, PETA stuff, and to be healthy, to eat healthy, requires not only extra money but also extra effort. And he talked in the book about how the people would come out to the organic farm on a certain date to get their eggs and their chickens and so forth and so on. You know, taking a trip just to get a small fraction of your groceries in one shot, and you know, driving an hour each way. That's a tough
Yeah, can I
way.
call you back
So,
on it?
You know,
Virtual meeting.
the future, we
Thank you.
got to make a lot of decisions about what we're going to do with food, and we have to balance priorities between the environment, economics, convenience, health. You know, it's really convenient to get a lot of the food that we use today, and throw it in the microwave and you got something. And you know, the amount of hours people spend in the kitchen is way down. And in terms of solutions, I don't have a lot. Obviously, there's going to be ongoing improvements, whether it's on the industrial side in the Betty Crocker kitchen, where they put not only 38 ingredients into the chicken McNuggets, but 39 or 40 or 41. And you know, we have laws now governing food purity, and the USDA inspects the meat, the FDA inspects other stuff, and we could always strengthen those. And I think we can provide further options. But you know, this book points out that there are a lot of downsides to where our food is right now, even though you know, we're not in a situation where we have been off and on in our world where famine is a big deal. And keep in mind, part of that is some of the advances like Norman Borlaug with his green revolution and the wonderful new hybrid wheats that came out in the 1950s and 60s, and he got a Nobel Prize for. So there's that's my story, and I'm sticking to it anyway. And I agree entirely with Kai. You know, this book could have been easily half the number of pages if there was an aggressive editor there. And you know, the guy just got to talking and talking and talking. So so who's next?
I believe I was Mitch, at least in terms of John's listing.
All right.
I unfortunately ran out of time before reading the book, although I did read several reviews of it, and I knew, of course, that Walt would be giving us a comprehensive review. Thank you so much for doing that, Walt. Let me build a little bit on what Colin said. And I too was struck with the relationship going back 100 years to Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. Interestingly, Sinclair's book was published in 1906, and this book was published literally 100 years later, 2006. Maybe a coincidence, or maybe somewhat deliberate. I can remember hearing about Sinclair in a high school history class with a wonderful history teacher named Mr. McMaster. He did a module on the muckrakers. He talked about people like Henry Demarest Lloyd, Ida M. Tarbell, and he also talked about Sinclair. And he claimed that Teddy Roosevelt was reading Sinclair's book, The Jungle, while he was having breakfast. All of a sudden, he near gagged and shouted out, "I've been poisoned." And that, according to my high school history teacher, was what led Teddy Roosevelt to instigate several governmental reforms that led to changes on meat packing. It also led to the Pure Food and Drug Act. Perhaps it's apocryphal because I do know that Teddy Roosevelt did not like Sinclair. Sinclair was a socialist. Teddy Roosevelt was not. But maybe I can suggest half facetiously an ending that perhaps we send Pollan's book to Joe Biden, suggest that he read it while he's having dinner, and maybe something will happen. Who knows?
Good. Anything else, Steve? Okay.
That's it. Thanks, Mitch.
Next?
How about Philip?
Sure. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, good afternoon, folks. I did read a good half of the book, and of course, I went through the Cliff Notes version, as well as enjoying Walt's presentation. And I'm fine with as detailed as it was. My concern would be that the level of detail would lend itself to looking back into my chemical engineering background, a process flow diagram of how that the corn production actually branches down into so many different things, and show we will often wonder about, well, what are the actual effects of these things? And if one breaks it down into the various parts, that's probably the only way you'll ever be able to calculate and understand what those cause. And obviously, it would, number of now with the number of different vegetables we have, fruits all times of the year, part of that flow diagram would be what's the use of petroleum to get those to us, whether they're flown in or trained in. And that's mentioned in the book, but it's still current, because as Mitch mentioned, we have this vast choices, but they come from all different distances. So the true cost of those to the climate, to use of petroleum, CO2 generation is calculable. One could do it if one took the trouble to go through that. And the book would be a good start. One thing that was missing, that perhaps was less emphasis back then, was any mention about sodium and how much effect that has on our potential health. And the reason it's to my attention is I had recently found very high blood pressure, and within 6-8 weeks, I was able to drop my blood pressure 15 or 20 points merely by dropping the amount of sodium in my diet, total diet, to about 1,500 milligrams a day. It's very difficult to do. The information was available, but the amount of calculation and time spent preparing meals and thinking it through was extensive. And part of it I found was that it appears in virtually anything that's not on those outer 3-4 walls of the grocery stores. Anything that's going to be packaged in cardboard or bag or whatever, almost all of that stuff is going to have amounts of sodium. It could be directly as salt. It could be in different preservatives, whatever. And one really needs to be careful of that. And especially internet recipes, even if they recommend low sodium recipes, some of the people don't account for other than the salt, and there are other components. So something to be very aware of was that if you took the trouble to really calculate and put together meals, you can drop your sodium dramatically. And personally, I had a huge effect, so I'm very happy with that. But that's something that's a takeaway message, is start taking a look at those nutrition panels and do a quick, add them up for a few days in a row of everything you're having. And you may be surprised just how much sodium you're actually having from, quote, ordinary foods in the stores. So that's a takeaway.
I like to mention something regarding sodium.
Yes.
I guess one reason for processed food, why they put so much salt in it, is because it helps preserve it a little bit better.
Right.
Okay. The other thing is, I saw an announcement saying, oh, Campbell's soup is going to reduce the sodium in their soups. And then the second paragraph was, well, they're going to do it slowly over time because people aren't used to less sodium. I said, well, that's ridiculous, And, and the other thing I like to mention is, there was a time I had bursts of high blood pressure, and I was, so I researched on the internet, and there's like 10 ways to help bring it down. And one of them is to eat things with potassium in it. So that would be like, bananas and mangoes, because potassium tricks the kidneys into eliminating sodium, and potassium doesn't cause high blood pressure. And the other, what was the other thing? The other thing is exercise, because exercise helps the kidneys get rid of water, which lowers the blood pressure.
Right.
And there were a couple. And also for salt, I usually like to use sea salt, because rather than pure sodium, it's some sodium and some potassium. So you get an adequate amount of salt, but not excessive sodium that way. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that the foods that are labeled low salt or reduced sodium, the question is still, isn't reduced enough to really matter or make a difference? You see low salt deli meat, thing like turkey, lean turkey sounds wonderful. Have it in a sandwich, right? Except lean turkey is 400 and something per serving, 410 milligrams per serving of sodium, and it's a crazy amount for 50 calories of turkey. I mean, looking for one, I was looking for a 1-to-1 ratio calories to sodium in my entire diet to try and get it under control. I'm just very happy it worked, and it's something like it's just addition and subtraction. It's really straightforward to try it out, especially if you're monitoring your own blood pressure at home.
Also, one thing I noticed the difference between Europe and here is, here they slaughter all the animals in the Chicago area. They make all the sausages. They put in nitrates and salt, and all that stuff is not good for you. And in Europe, I don't know how many countries actually do this, but every city has a butcher, and they make the sausages, and it has none of that. No,
Right.
no salt, no nitrates, no nitrites, and it's really delicious. I don't eat hot dogs here because I don't like the flavor of it, but more and more I notice they're selling meats without nitrates and nitrites, and but then I read articles. What they do is they add celery, which contains naturally contains nitrites or something,
And sodium too. Relatively high amount of sodium.
and probably sodium. But so people in Europe do things differently than they do here. So anyway.
Well, thanks to all. I appreciate the opportunity to comment.
Who's next?
Who's up next?
Did Colin say anything yet?
Yes, he did.
Okay. What about you, Rich Jager?
Rich.
Yeah, I've got a few comments. I got halfway through, and I appreciate Kai's comments, helped to explain why I only got halfway through. And I guess the other part, besides the book being longer than it had to be, is that I found it a little bit of a slog to read. And from comments that some people have made, the tougher parts to read come in the second half. So I may have actually been spared the hardest part, but it didn't bring you along. It was pretty clear to me early on, like maybe the introduction, that he had an argument of some sort to present. He had a position, he had a perspective, and he was going to make the argument, give the perspective, and try and persuade me and all the other readers to his perspective. One of the things that I think that resulted in is that he, as nearly as I could tell, having gone halfway through, did not address benefits. Mitch gave a long list of benefits. We've got at least a global issue, and perhaps as well a US issue, about hunger and even famine. And a lot of what has happened in the way of food technology has gone in the direction of helping to alleviate hunger and famine. And I don't think he got to that at all. It would have been nice if he presented a solution. I gather he didn't. Maybe Joel Salatin's farm is a solution. I mean, it's certainly, I'm still in the section where he's talking about the farm, but it sounded like he was saying that, this is doable. I got the impression it doesn't really cost more, and it's got lots of benefits. So maybe Joel Salatin's farm is a solution. but I don't know if, certainly in the part I read, he did not present that as a solution. Maybe later on, he was a little more positive about it. So the question remaining in my mind is that a workable solution? You know, assuming that people adopted it, and Archer Daniels Midland is probably not going to run out and adopt it. So it's the impetus is going to have to come from another place. Somebody was mentioning high fructose corn syrup and how bad that can be. And a number of years ago, I was tipped off by a friend to do some reading about sugar, which of course, high fructose corn syrup is, well, I'm tempted to say sugar on steroids. And by and large, sugar is bad for you. It just is. It messes with the metabolism. You know, a little bit's okay. Somebody mentioned earlier that things have gotten sweeter as we've gone through the advances in food technology. They've managed to make the corn a whole lot sweeter. So sweeter, sweeter, sweeter. Everything's getting sweeter, and you know, even beyond high fructose corn syrup, sugar is just bad for you. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Yeah, I like to say something. You know, when I first read the book, I sort of remembered that the poly-based farm, you know, was pasture and only 20% was forest. But when I reread it, I realized 80% was forest, and the book claimed he actually needed that forest to, you know, to farm effectively. The book doesn't make any real comparison between, you know, what is the net output of, you know, of the Nyler farm versus the polyface farm in terms, you know, I mean, are they equivalent? Does one produce more than the other? You know, somehow I got the feeling that industrial farming still produces more food than the polyface farm method, you know, but it wasn't clear to me, you know, it just left me, you know, so I wish he had, you know, quantified that more, or, you know, because if the polyface farm was more efficient, then it really should be adopted on a wide scale basis, you know, but.
Well, the difference, pardon me, the difference is if you had a polyface farm and you had efficient transportation to population centers that didn't cost much, and you had a lot of those farms, it might work out, because the big benefit, as I understand it, is that he minimizes use of fertilizer and minimizes use of petrochemicals, machinery. He doesn't use machinery very much. And so on a, would you talk the climate change issue, which is very important. I mean, fertilizer is ruining our climate, and transportation right now is ruining our climate. And so it's possible that if you had a multitude of these farms and you had efficient transportation to population centers, it might work out. Because I think that our current system, our agribusiness system, is ruining our planet. It is truly ruining our planet. And even you think the food is cheap, but of course that's because we have cheap petroleum. Sorry.
No need to be sorry. You're absolutely right. Now, lots of different ways to look at this, and no simple solution. You know, there's just no way you're going to snap your fingers and make it perfect.
Right.
Who's left? Mark Edelman, are you the last one? Are you the final
Yeah,
one?
maybe. I don't know how to. I hardly know what to say, because this discussion went so many places that the book doesn't go. I mean, people seem to expect that this book would fulfill their wishes, you know, that it should be a diet book, that it should be a solutions book, that it should cover everything but be brief. I don't know how you build up those expectations. I read the book and I enjoyed it, and I read the whole book, but I'm not trying to be self-righteous about it. It meant something to me because of what it did say, not because of what it didn't say. What I learned more than anything, I learned, first of all, that food is not cheap. Okay? I mean, in America, we spend very little money on food compared to other things. But we're actually spending far, far more. It's just that we don't spend it at the supermarket. We spend it in our taxes, we spend it in our deficits, we spend it in the destruction that we cause. We spend it a lot of different ways. It's just that we don't see that we spend it. So that's one lesson that I learned from this book. Food is expensive, the way we produce it. And I learned that there are alternatives. And the other thing I learned that was big to me is that this all fits in with the what you might call the policy history of this country. Contrary to what I thought when I was in school, we don't live in what you might call a self-supporting economy. We live in an extractive economy. A lot of what we do in this country, and of course in many other countries too, is we just take things out more and more until we use them up. That's how the agricultural economy of this country was founded. It was founded on settlers going into virgin land and cutting the forests, starting to grow crops, depleting the soil, and then leaving and going further west. And this has been our history. We extract the wildlife, we extract the trees, we extract the fertility of the soil, and then we move on. And this is the same thing we do with petroleum, and it's the same thing we do with a lot of things. So it gave me a different viewpoint on our economy and on how our institutions and our policies create that economy. And where is it going? Well, it doesn't look good. And people mentioned fertilizer. Yes, that's a big part of it too. And that is a highly extractive thing. You take very, very large amounts of energy, which historically come from fossil fuels, and you use that to create artificial fertilizer on which agriculture around the world today depends. And without it, we would be starving. How are we going to change that? I don't know. And certainly this book does not solve those problems, but it does present them. And, you know, I learned that a great deal of the way farming is done in this country today is the result of policies that have happened since the very beginning. The policy on land settlement, the homesteading and such, the policies on how we populated the Great Plains and what we did to them, policies on land ownership, policies on subsidizing mineral rights, and on and on and on. The railroads and many other things that were the result of, political decision making. I'm not saying I could have done it better or anything like that. What I'm saying is that it gives you an insight to the history. How did we get to this point? And for those reasons, I thought the book was very valuable.
Okay.
I'd like to say something.
Oh, of course, go ahead.
When I first read the book, I always had the intentions of visiting Polyface Farm, you know. So now that I reread it, maybe the old guard could organize a trip to stay at a B&B down there. And we eat at the local restaurants and visit the farm. You know, that would be a neat experience.
You know,
Bring it up with the troops committee. Bobby?
Recently, I was in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We visited the Indian reservation, and the way the Indians were confined to a place and the way they were excluded from the action gave me a little bit of sad reflection of how we are destroyed slowly the land and things like that.
So you're going to pick a book for next time?
Yeah, but I put something in the chat. I'm not suggesting we read it, but there's a book called The Poison Squad, which is exactly what Steve was talking about during FDR or TR's time, where they came and a whole bunch of chemists figured out what was contaminating all of the food and killing half the kids in an orphanage with doctored up milk, all kind of stuff like that. But I think maybe we don't need to have another one of these. Oh my God, we're eating shit here. So, anybody got a suggestion?
Actually, PBS did a program on that topic, a while back.
Dozens, yeah. That's standard. Yeah. Well, okay. Anyway, go. I'm sorry, Walt. I stumped on you.
No, I said PBS had a program on the Poison Squad. Explained what happened and how changes were brought about because people were putting additives in it, and it turns out it was really killing people. And there was a person that actually scientifically documented this by having control groups and non-control groups to, show that certain additives had a detrimental effect.
Right. Okay. Suggestions for a book for next time? What?
I think it should be a short book so that people can finish it.
No more than 100 pages.
I have no comment.
Go ahead.
No, I have no comment.
No comment.
What happened to that long list of books you had before?
I'm not keeping it. It's either Walter or it's either Tittle or John Baxter. I've got one. Just a second.
While he's looking, Mark made a wonderful point about policy. And I'd say recently, the most significant policy was Butts, the Secretary of Agriculture or whatever. They passed the Farm Bill such that it supported agribusiness rather than farmers. And it changed completely how it led to what we'd call the industrial farm system, the industrial agriculture system. And of course, that's what you'd say, we have a plutocracy that made sure that happened.
Okay, absent any other suggestions other than a short book, I got one that's 120 pages and it's I'm sorry, whoever it is, it doesn't matter. It's The Cause of Freedom, and it's by Jonathan Holloway. And if that name rings a bell, he's the president of Rutgers University right today. And it's a concise history of African Americans. Just tossing it out there. Not the only reason I suggested is I already read it, so I don't have to do anything the next 2 months.
How many days? Next month, is that right?
No, 2 months.
2 months.
Yeah, 2 whole months to do this. You know, if you guys want to go with that, that's fine. If you want to have go back and have John suggest a few, and we can vote on it.
Let's do that. Let's do that.
Let's do the cause of freedom.
Do what?
Cause of freedom.
Okay, I'll go back.
He's agreeing with you that he thinks the book is a good choice.
Could you put it in the chat so we can see what, put the author and the
Well, if I could type.
Yeah, I would favor giving this a little more time to make a decision. Get
agree with
a
that.
few
just
more
add it to the
ideas.
list. Add it to the list.
All right.
Yeah, I would suggest you send out the list to the 17 people who attended today's meeting, and they could give some inputs as to which one they might prefer.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Let me see what did you put in the chat?
I have to go now, so I'm going to leave. Thank you all.
Just indicate, Mitch, the title of the book and the author, and if available, the number of pages.
There you go. Walt's always up on doing it on Amazon. Or
Personally,
wherever.
for me, I would like to read reviews before I decide what I want to read, because the titles frequently are not all that descriptive.
Okay. All right, we'll kick it back to John and Bill as the hosts of this group, and I just want to thank everybody. I don't know how I ended up. Oh, Walt, you want to close it out?
You're muted, Walt.
Anybody that wants a copy of my view graphs and also didn't get a copy of the Cliff's Notes, send me an email by 6 p.m. tonight, and I'll email it out. I know
Okay.
Dick Aiken wants a copy, but anybody else that wants a copy of the view graphs. And I have some links in there. I really couldn't talk about it, but there's some interesting links in toward the end, you know.
Good. I'll send you an email, Walt. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Okay, are we done then?
Yes.
All right. Well, I have no idea, Phil, how the weather is out there in Seattle, but here it's gorgeous. So everybody get outside and get some vitamin D.
Thank you.
Smoke here today.
Oh, sorry to hear that.
Couple days a year we have it, so I'll
Okay.
deal with
So
it.
we had a really good turnout.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
great.
Bye, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Mitch, and thanks, Walt.
Thank you.